This is lecture 17C. So I talked last time about how there's this big intellectual shift that was happening in Europe as these new universities wrestled with all this new Aristotelian and Muslim knowledge. But there were lots of other changes happening in Europe. And over the course of the High Middle Ages, I talked about the fact that Europe, the population of Europe had tripled, and between 1000 and 1300, and Europe had basically increased the amount of land that was brought under cultivation as farmland until they had pretty much cut down all the forests. They had just had a few managed forests left, and they had pretty much reduced, drained all the swamps and reduced all the woods. They had turned everything they could possibly turn into farmland because the population required it. Well, this means that Europe was actually very close to a Malthusian crisis. And what I mean by that is that they were maximizing their food production, and it was just barely enough to feed the population. So if the population goes any higher, they're going to have famines and shortages, or if anything happens to food production, they're going to have famines and shortages. Well, sure enough, that's exactly what happened. In the 1310s, there were a series of bad years. Sometimes it was that they'd have a really rainy year where it rained all the time and the crops rotted in the fields. They had an outbreak of rinderpest that killed lots of livestock all across the continent. They did a whole series of mishaps and misfortunes that caused bad famines in a number of years. And throughout the 1310s, this great famine, it was called, it hit different areas at different times. Now it was hitting, Belgium. Now it was hitting southern France. But overall, it might have killed 10% of the population over a few years. Historians have wondered whether the Great Famine was due to climate change. There was a lot of weird weather that happened, and overall, it looks like, although the data is not entirely conclusive, it looks like Europe started to slide in the 1300s into a period of colder weather, colder climate, where it got colder in the winters. The summers were shorter, the winters were longer, and most importantly, you got very, very different rainfall patterns. Whether or not the Great Famine was caused by that or just bad luck is still up for debate, but it did cause massive loss of life. And then, in 1347, a new problem emerged, which was the Black Death. The Black Death had begun in China, probably somewhere in Central Asia, Western China, and it had spread along the Silk Road. So it arrived in the Middle East, and it actually, the Mongols had to deal with the Black Death, and as it spread through the Middle East, it began to hit what's called virgin soil populations, which is the populations that had not been exposed to it in centuries, and so had really no significant resistance to it, and so it began to cause massive losses of life. And the Black Death spread through the Middle East. It arrived in Italy in late, like December of 1347, on merchant ships that had come from the Black Sea. And then it spread through Italy, and it spread from Italy up throughout the rest of Europe and petered out in Russia and Scandinavia in 1350 or so. And wherever it went, the Black Death caused the death of 30 to 50% of the population. In fact, in some cities, it was killing 50% of the population and maybe even 2/3 of the population. Overall, the numbers are 25 to 50%. And in fact, over the last several decades, historians have been looking very carefully at death rates and trying to figure out how many people died. And that percentage is sort of inching up. For a long time, the consensus was 33% of the population died. Now, some historians are saying that the evidence is there that maybe 50% of the population died. And this isn't 50% of the population dying over 3 years. When the Black Death hit a place like Genoa or something, it caused 33 to 50% of the population to die within a couple months, right? So the death rate, it was just overwhelming how many people were dying in such great numbers in such a short amount of time wherever the Black Death hit. Now, the Black Death, just like the Justinian Plague, which I talked about in a previous discussion, really caused enormous social unrest because essentially it hit cities hardest, so it disrupted trade dramatically because you have so many people dying in cities, and cities would just sort of drop out of, stop all trade. And if there's an outbreak of plague in the city, nobody is going to that city voluntarily, so nobody is trading with that city. So it caused massive disruptions of trading networks across Europe. But it also causes huge problems with figuring out who owns what, and if an aristocrat and all of his heirs die, who inherits that title, who's the feudal ruler of this land, or what have you. It begins to cause serious chaos that way. But the biggest way it caused chaos was that it caused massive losses of peasants' lives. And now, the aristocrats had lots of land, and they had the right to everything that land produced, but if there's nobody actually working on that land, the land is not actually producing anything. And so aristocrats desperately need peasants. They need someone doing the work. But if peasants are, if 33% of the peasants have died off, that means that it's sort of a seller's market for peasants. And peasants began to ask, and you began to see wages rise in cities and in the countryside. You began to see rents on land go down, and it began, and aristocrats really began to feel this pinch, and business owners in the cities began to feel this pinch because there was a labor shortage, right? And in response to that, they began to pass laws and to try to depress wages artificially, to put caps on wages. You can't raise wages, and they try to do all sorts of ways to squeeze more money out of the existing peasants. And this backlash against the bargaining power of peasants would lead to and higher taxes, and et cetera, and it would lead to peasant unrest. And so in both France and England, in a decade or two after the Black Death, you saw massive peasant uprisings, the Jacquerie in France and the Peasants' Revolt in England. And essentially these get put down by force, and they don't actually cause massive changes in policy, et cetera, but they are enormous social unrest. And ultimately, a lot of historians suspect that the Black Death had a significant negative impact on feudalism, in the sense that it began to seriously strain feudal relationships, especially if peasants could just take off and go find a better deal elsewhere. They're leaving. And in particular, serfdom is pretty much dying right now. Serfdom is where a peasant is tied legally to a piece of land he can't leave. Well, if peasants can just take off and run, and the aristocrats are desperately trying to hold on to their peasants, but serfdom is not a way they're going to entice anybody to stay around. So people only accept serfdom if they don't think they have any other options, and if there's a labor shortage, they have lots of other options, right? And so all of this in the Black Death, it really destabilized a lot of European civilization in some very significant ways. And you can start to see cultural and social shifts after the 1300s that would ultimately sort of undermine the Middle Ages and lead to the Renaissance and Reformation, et cetera, which I'll talk about in History 112. Or if you want to, you can also take my History 221 Medieval Europe in the second session of this semester. I'll just mention in passing that remember the Ruddiman hypothesis that I talked about in one of the discussions, that Ruddiman is this climate scientist who thinks that, in fact, human beings have been controlling global warming for quite a while, and any huge shifts in population cause shifts in CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And Ruddiman argues that, in fact, the Black Death, by killing off so many people so quickly in the Middle East, which had similar death rates, as well as Europe, actually led to massive reforestation as farmland returned to forest, and this caused a dramatic decrease in CO2 levels and methane levels in the atmosphere. And Ruddiman argues that, in fact, the sort of climate shift you see beginning in the 1300s, he says it initially might have been triggered by the Mongols killing so many people across China and the Middle East, but it might have taken a significant turn with the Black Death, because that killed more people, right? And again, the Ruddiman hypothesis is a hypothesis. It has not been proven, but it is still open for debate. Okay, so you have the Great Famine, you have the Black Death. The 1300s also saw the beginning of the 100 Years' War, and this is a massive war. It actually lasts, so you can see, 116 years. 116 years. And it's essentially a dynastic dispute over who's the king of France. The houses of France and England had been closely intertwined because in 1066 a French nobleman, William the Conqueror, conquers England and makes himself king of England. But he's still a French nobleman too, which means he has relationships with all the royal family in France, etc. And in several hundred years later, in 1337, this breaks out into a dynastic dispute. As the king of France, there's one guy who claims to be the king of France, and then the king of England says, no, I'm the king of France because I inherited it. And they fight a whole series of battles. There's an initial phase of this between 1337 and 1350s that leads to a series of battles, and then there's a calm period, and then some sporadic fighting, and then there's another big outbreak of fighting in the early 1400s. The Hundred Years' War is important not because of the warfare itself. There actually weren't that many battles, but it led to massive instability in France, as it actually led to splits within the French aristocratic class over who they were going to back, whether they backed the English or the French. And so you had the Burgundians versus the Armagnacs or the Orleanists, and it also led to the French side in particular hiring mercenary armies. And often after a battle, the mercenaries are just told, okay, we're done hiring you. Well, these mercenaries often wound up wandering around France and just sort of raping and robbing and pillaging because nobody could stop them because they were a big military force. And so the Hundred Years' War led to enormous suffering. And just, I mean, for France, it was really bad because the Black Death breaks out in the middle of the Hundred Years' War. And in fact, the peasant revolt is the Jacquerie in France is in the middle of the Hundred Years' War, and it's in many ways in response to the shifts in the labor market that I talked about as a result of the Black Death, but also it's a result of the King of France being captured and having to pay a huge ransom and trying to tax people to pay that ransom, which led to unrest also. So all of this is to say that the 1300s, you start to see some really socially disruptive things. The sort of stable society of the Middle Ages from 1000 to 1300 is starting to come apart. And there's one thing that I mentioned previously that I should mention again, and that is heresy, that you began to see heretical movements pop up in southern France and northern Italy and then in England, and these heretical movements are basically saying we think the church is corrupt and we want a better form of Christianity, a sort of a pure back to basics form of Christianity. And this also is causing people to question the institutions and the sort of the social structures of medieval Europe. And so medieval Europe after the 1300s is really starting to come apart. And throughout the late 1300s, the 1400s, and in the 1400s, you can see all sorts of things percolating which are causing Europe to really be under enormous strain. And we'll see, if you take History 112 in the winter term, we'll see what happens with the Reformation, with the Renaissance, etc., which sets Europe on a completely different course. But for right now, that is Europe in the Middle Ages.